Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm coming at you this morning bright and early to talk about religions. Now, in my last video, we talked about the Abrahamic religions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, today we're going to focus on religions more focused in the eastern part of the world. We're going to focus on two major Chinese religions, one major Japanese religion, and then we're going to cover some catch-all terms. So the two major religions out of China that we're going to talk about are Confucianism and Taoism. Now, there is a third, and we'll get to that at the end. But we're going to focus on those two today. But before we dive into that, I want to talk about these catch-all terms. I really want to get into these because these are words that you're going to see from time to time to describe a faith or a religion or a region, and I want to make sure you know what they mean. The first is shamanism. Now, shamanism is a term that more or less historians or anthropologists came up with to describe a phenomenon that we saw occurring in several different places around the world in different ways. It's not uncommon for a group of people to have a holy person who acts as a bit of a bridge between the spiritual world and the human world. This person might come in the form of a healer or a magi. They might have perceived or powers that can help or assist or frighten or terrify the group of people that they are from. We label this person shaman, okay? And if there is a region or a group of people that believes in that shaman, we refer to them as a shamanistic culture. That's why it's kind of hard to describe, because it is meant to describe a bunch of people who do things similarly. Here we see a Nepalese shaman conducting a purifying ritual, right? This is the type of activity that we might see in a shamanistic culture. Next is perhaps even more vague is the term animism. Animism is really what we describe a culture or a group of people who believe in the spiritual. But it can vary wildly from region to region, or place to place, or civilization to civilization. Animistic cultures can believe in the concept of a spirit or a soul that resides within a human being, within animals, within all nature, within some part or all of the above. They can believe in a spirit world or an afterlife, or not quite. There's a lot there. And so I just want to make sure that we know this term, that when a group of people is spiritual, but it's not quite a organized set of religions, they might very well be an animistic culture. Now, that animism can take its form in a variety of ways. And we see aspects of animism in several religions that are even still practiced today. That's why I'm actually going to do these out of chronological order going forward. And we're going to cover Shintoism first. Now, Shintoism comes around in about the 6th century CE, which is later than both Confucianism and Taoism, which is what we're going to be talking about in a second. But I'm covering it first because I wanted to explain what animism was and then give an example of an animistic religion. Now, Shintoism is not necessarily a religion, and that's actually going to be the case with all the religions we're talking about today. Shintoism, Taoism, and Confucianism are philosophies that can be followed with religious fervor. So we're going to treat them as religions because even though they don't always have to be followed with the pomp and circumstance that we normally attribute to religion, they oftentimes are followed with all of the pomp and circumstance and ritual that we see in religion. And so we treat them as religions, even though they aren't always. I know that's confusing, but that's kind of how it is. Now, Shintoism, again, because it is animistic and because it is not centralized in its organization, can have differing beliefs from region to region. But there are some things that are pretty well stable, right? There's much tradition and familial importance. There is a love of nature and the holding of nature as sacred. There's a ritual purity. Purification rituals are common in Shintoism in any aspect or form that it's found. Right? And this purification is going to be important if you are going to visit a kami. Kami is a shrine. You can see an example of one right behind my words here in the red. These shrines are scattered all throughout Japan and beyond as a place of pilgrimage and purification. Then finally, there's the concept of matsuri, the worshiping of and honoring of gods and ancestral spirits. Now, ancestral worship is another aspect that we're going to see in several religions. It's going to be in Taoism as well. The idea that the ancestors, those who have come before us, should be honored and even worshipped for having moved on to the spiritual world. This is common. Ancestral worship is common in animistic and shamanistic cultures. Now, we're going to move on to Taoism next. Okay, Taoism, because it is, again, a little confusing, right? Taoism is a organized religion that, in fact, even comes into prominence as the official state religion of China underneath the Tang dynasty. But it predates that quite a bit. And it's arguable to say that Taoism has been practiced in some form or fashion by the Chinese peasant class as far back as the 12th or 13th century BCE, although it seems to have changed quite a bit over time. Now, we can relate that back because we have the I Ching. The I Ching is a text that is not necessarily Taoist, but has in it some Taoist principles and ideas, although the I Ching is primarily an instruction manual on how to read the oracle bones that could be cast to understand one's place in time. That being said, Taoism gets celebrated as the native religion of China. So its primary text comes from a philosopher named Lao Tzu. Now, I love his story. Lao Tzu was a curator at the Royal Library and a philosopher. So he was serving the dynasty of his time. And he was a virtue ethicist. He was focused a lot on how to live a good life, how to live correctly. But he allegedly got so fed up with the fact that he could convince no one to lead a better life, or at least not enough people to change their lives, that he eventually decided at the age of 80 years old to become a hermit, to leave society entirely and go live in the wilderness alone by himself. He hopped on a water buffalo and headed out of China. But on his way out, he gets stopped by a customs officer of a kind who recognizes him as a philosopher. And the two of them get to talking. And the officer asks Lao Tzu, he says, wait a second, you're leaving, you're never coming back, but you're a philosopher. We need to know your story. We need to know what you know. Will you please, before you leave, will you sit here and write it all down? So Lao Tzu does. And from that, we get the Tao Te Ching. Now, that's a wonderful story. Whether or not it's true, we're not going to concern ourselves with it. But that is actually what gets recorded in history. The Tao Te Ching is not a scripture. It's important to know that. The Tao Te Ching is poetry, mostly, but it's a recommendation on how to live and more or less what to focus on. I highly recommend that you read it. It's a beautiful book. It focuses a lot on finding harmony with the Tao, which is a cosmic force that flows through all things, that binds and releases them. If that sounds like the Force from Star Wars, it's because that's where they got the idea for the Force from Star Wars, right? Taoism is focused on balance, harmony, and finding a good relationship with man and nature and man and himself, right? Which is why, even though the yin yang, as you see right there next to it, even though the yin yang was not originally a Taoist symbol, it actually did get adopted by Taoism because it does represent the same ideas of harmony and balance. Now, Taoism does get adopted like I said, as the official state religion of the Tang Empire, which was a departure from the previous Sui Empire, who had been primarily Buddhist, and the Han Empire, which is the dynasty prior to that, who had been primarily Confucian. And whether there's political reasons as to why Taoism gets made the state religion, we're not going to get too far into right now. I want you to understand what the religion is. But Taoism stays active and is even still practiced today. It was definitely at its height, though, under the Tang. Now, we're going to move on to Confucianism. Now, Confucius was close to a contemporary of Lao Tzu. He writes, it lives in the 500s BCE. Now, he ends up writing a book called The Analects of Confucius. Again, I highly recommend it, but we're going to talk about it in a second. You see, Confucius, he was a court philosopher, and he was around for the official abandonment of the concept of legalism by the Qin dynasty. Okay. Now, I almost had a whole section here on legalism, but legalism really is not practiced as a religion. It is a philosophy. It's one of the 6 primary schools of thought in China at the time. Confucianism and Taoism are 2 of them. Legalism is a 3rd, and you can read about the rest if you'd like. Legalism, in short, is the idea that human beings are inherently flawed, and as such, there must be strict legislation to make them do good. You can guess at how well human beings handle being legislated into doing good. But Confucius writes the Analects, which really serve as a foundation for Chinese thought, at least one of the main foundations of Chinese thought, and is still a foundation of Chinese thought today. He's a humanist. He is writing about the relationships of human beings, and he focuses on 5 primary relationships: ruler to ruled, husband to wife, father to son, elder brother to younger brother, and friend to friend. Now, I don't know if you noticed, not one of those relationships had anything to do with a woman's relationship, except for husband to wife, not the other way around. It's true that Confucius focuses almost exclusively on men, and that's, a bit of a product of his time. But there's not much there for women, at least to start. Now, the 5 key relationships also relate to the 5 constants and the 4 virtues of Confucianism. Right? These are ideas like humaneness, righteousness, proper right, knowledge, and integrity. Those are the 5 constants. And then the 4 virtues that should be practiced are loyalty, filial piety, continency, and righteousness. Now, there's a word there that I used, filial piety. One of the key relationships that you heard me talk about was father to son. In Confucianism, it is important that a son show loyalty to his father, regardless of how the father treats the son. This is going to be very important to China on a societal level for millennia. It's important, it's foundational, and I want to make sure you know that term and that filial piety comes from Confucianism. Now, that's it. That's all we're going to get into these religions. It's barely scraping the surface, and I encourage you to read more. Now, like I said, we only focused on 2 of China's 3 main religions. Now, the reason we did that is because Confucianism and Taoism both start in China. The 3rd primary religion of China, Buddhism, isn't Chinese. It's from India. So in our next video, we're going to discuss Hinduism and Buddhism, because those are the religions that come out of India, and how Buddhism moves from India to China and how it changes when it does that. Thanks so much for listening, and keep perspective.